What happens when a desperate alien emperor makes the most dangerous gamble in galactic history? When political survival forces him to bind his bloodline to the most unpredictable species in the known universe. The Zephyrian Empire has ruled for 10,000 years through careful calculation, measured responses, and absolute control. But humans? Humans don't follow the rules. They don't respect ancient protocols. They certainly don't bow to traditions that have governed civilizations since before their species could even dream of reaching the stars. Emperor Valdris thought he was securing his dynasty when he offered his daughter's hand to a human diplomat. A simple political marriage to gain Earth's military support against rebel factions threatening his throne. What he didn't anticipate was that his alien princess would learn something far more dangerous than human warfare tactics. She would learn to think like a human. Now, with her father's empire teetering on the edge of collapse and enemies closing in from all sides, Princess Lyralii must choose between the rigid chains of her ancestry and the terrifying freedom of human ambition. But when you give a princess the mindset of humanity's greatest conquerors, the galaxy itself becomes her battlefield. Some alliances change the balance of power. Others rewrite the very meaning of power itself. This is the story of how one marriage didn't just save an empire, it transformed the entire galaxy. Emperor Valdris stood before the massive viewing portal of his flagship, watching the human fleet emerge from hyperspace like predators materializing from the void. Each vessel bore the scars of countless battles, their hulls a patchwork of repairs that spoke of survival against impossible odds. Unlike the pristine, symmetrical designs of Zephyrian warships, these human craft looked almost primitive, yet Valdris had seen the battle reports. He knew what those seemingly crude vessels could accomplish. The Emperor's crystalline scales shifted from deep purple to anxious silver, a physiological response he couldn't suppress despite decades of political training. Behind him, the throne chamber buzzed with nervous energy as his advisors whispered among themselves, their own scales flickering through the spectrum of uncertainty. The Zephyrian Empire had never needed to negotiate from a position of weakness before, and the unfamiliarity of it left everyone on edge. Your Imperial Majesty, Admiral Corvex approached with measured steps, his military bearing unchanged despite the circumstances. The human diplomatic vessel is requesting permission to dock. Ambassador Richardson is aboard, along with his delegation. Valdris nodded slowly, his four eyes never leaving the human fleet. How many ships did they bring, Admiral? 37 combat vessels, Majesty, including 3 of their Dreadnought-class ships. Corvex paused, his own scales darkening. Intelligence suggests each Dreadnought carries enough firepower to level a planetary capital. The Emperor's eldest daughter, Princess Lyralii, stepped forward from her position near the throne. Her scales maintained the royal blue of the Imperial bloodline, though Valdris noticed the slight tremor in her secondary arms, a sign of either fear or excitement. At 230 years old, she was barely past adolescence by Zephyrian standards, yet her intelligence had always impressed him. "Father," she said, her voice carrying the melodic tones of their species, "may I ask why the humans have brought such a substantial fleet for a diplomatic mission?" Valdris turned from the viewport, his expression grave. "Because, my daughter, they understand something that we have perhaps forgotten. In negotiations, respect is often measured not by words, but by the force that stands behind those words." The truth was more complicated than he could admit in front of his court. The rebellion in the outer systems had grown beyond anyone's expectations. 3 entire star systems had declared independence, and their combined fleets had already crushed 2 Imperial task forces. The rebels possessed something the Empire lacked: desperation and innovation. They fought with tactics that defied traditional military doctrine, striking at supply lines, communication networks, and civilian infrastructure with ruthless efficiency. More troubling still were the reports of rebel alliances with the Krex Confederation and the Thorian Syndicate. If those partnerships solidified, the Empire would face enemies on multiple fronts, with forces that outnumbered the Imperial fleet 3-1. The Zephyrian military machine, built for maintaining order and projecting power, wasn't designed for the kind of total war that loomed on the horizon. "Majesty," Chancellor Drex approached with the careful gait of someone bearing unwelcome news. We've received additional intelligence reports from the Outer Rim conflicts. The rebel fleet has been reinforced with captured Imperial vessels, and their commanders appear to be implementing new tactical doctrines. What kind of tactics? Valdris asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Hit-and-run strikes, resource denial, civilian population manipulation for intelligence gathering. Methods that are, Drex paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. Unconventional by Imperial standards. Lyraliai's scales shifted to an interested green. These sound similar to the strategies described in the human military histories we studied in the Academy. Are you suggesting the rebels are adopting human warfare doctrine? The silence that followed her observation was telling. Valdris had suspected as much for months, but hearing it stated so plainly by his daughter crystallized the reality of their situation. The rebels weren't just fighting the Empire, they were learning to fight like humans, and that made them exponentially more dangerous. Which brings us to today's negotiations, Valdris said, gesturing toward the docking bay where human shuttles were already beginning their approach. The Terran Alliance has agreed to provide military advisors and tactical support in exchange for, he hesitated, the words difficult to speak aloud. Significant concessions. What manner of concessions, father? Lyraliai asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Before Valdris could respond, the great doors of the throne chamber slid open with a pneumatic hiss. The human delegation entered with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, their movements sharp and purposeful in a way that made the gathered Zephyrian nobles uncomfortable. At their head walked Ambassador Richardson, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the throne room in a single sweep. What struck Valdris most about the humans wasn't their physical appearance. He'd seen humans before in diplomatic functions, but the way they carried themselves. Every member of the delegation moved as if they owned the space they occupied, as if the very concept of deference was foreign to them. The contrast with Zephyrian court protocol was jarring. Your Imperial Majesty, Richardson said, offering a slight bow that was technically respectful, but felt somehow insufficient. Thank you for receiving us. I trust you've had time to review our proposal. Ambassador, Valdris replied, descending from his throne with all the dignity he could muster. We have indeed reviewed your terms. However, some elements require clarification. Richardson smiled, an expression that revealed far too many teeth for Zephyrian comfort. Of course, Majesty. Perhaps we could discuss the details in a more private setting. These negotiations affect not just our species, but the balance of power in this entire sector. The Emperor gestured toward a side chamber, but Richardson's gaze had already shifted to Princess Lyraliai. If I may, Your Majesty, I believe the princess should be present for these discussions. After all, the proposal does concern her future rather directly. Lyraliai's scales shifted through several colors in rapid succession. Surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been anticipation. Valdris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. The humans had done their research, had identified exactly which pressure points to target. They knew about the succession laws, about Lyraliai's position as heir apparent, about the political ramifications of any marriage alliance. Very well, Valdris said, his voice carefully controlled. Princess, please join us. The private chamber was smaller, more intimate, designed for delicate negotiations rather than grand displays of power. As the doors sealed behind them, Richardson's demeanor shifted subtly. The diplomatic polish remained, but underneath it, Valdris sensed the calculating mind of a predator. Let's speak plainly, Majesty, Richardson began, settling into a chair with casual ease. Your empire is facing an existential crisis. The rebels have superior numbers. They're using unconventional tactics that your military isn't equipped to counter, and they're building alliances that will soon make them unstoppable. You need our help, and you need it now. Valdris's scales darkened, but he said nothing. The truth was a blade that cut both ways. In exchange, Richardson continued, we're offering not just military advisors, but full tactical integration. Human commanders working alongside your forces, sharing our strategic doctrines, providing the kind of asymmetric warfare expertise that could turn this conflict around. He paused, his gaze shifting to Lyraliai. But Such a partnership requires more than a simple treaty. It requires trust. It requires permanence. You're proposing a marriage alliance, Lyralii said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being discussed. Between myself and a human representative. Not just any representative, Richardson replied. My son, Marcus. He's 35 years old, a decorated veteran of our conflicts with the hegemony, and currently serving as a strategic analyst in our military command structure. More importantly, he understands the value of adaptive thinking. Valdris studied the ambassador carefully. Everything about this proposal spoke of meticulous planning, of a chess game played several moves in advance. And what exactly would the Terran Alliance gain from such an arrangement, beyond the obvious political advantages? Richardson's smile widened. Trade concessions, of course. Mining rights in the Chronos system. Access to your hyperdrive technology for reverse engineering. But more than that, majesty, a foothold in galactic politics. Humanity is ready to take its place among the major powers, and an alliance with the Zephyrian Empire would accelerate that process considerably. The Emperor felt the weight of 10,000 years of tradition pressing down on him. The Zephyrian Empire had maintained its power through careful control, through adherence to ancient customs and protocols that had proven their worth across millennia. But those same traditions were now strangling them, making them predictable in a galaxy that rewarded innovation and adaptability. Princess, he said, turning to his daughter, you understand what this would mean? You would be leaving everything you know, everything our people have built, to marry into a species that follows none of our customs. Lyralii was quiet for a long moment, her scales cycling through colors that reflected her inner turmoil. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised even Valdris. Father, with respect, what have our traditions accomplished lately? The rebels are winning because they've abandoned our way of thinking, our way of fighting. Perhaps it's time we learn to do the same. She looked directly at Richardson. Tell me about your son. Not his qualifications or his achievements, but who he is as a person. Richardson's expression softened slightly, revealing what might have been genuine paternal affection. Marcus is complicated. He's brilliant, but he thinks in ways that often frustrate his superiors. He sees patterns where others see chaos, and he's willing to take risks that more conservative minds would never consider. He's also honorable, in his own way, though his definition of honor might not align with your traditions. In other words, Lyralii said, he thinks like a human. Exactly like a human, Richardson confirmed, which is precisely why this alliance could work. You need someone who can bridge the gap between your imperial structure and our adaptive methodologies. Valdris watched his daughter carefully, seeing something in her expression that both thrilled and terrified him. There was an eagerness there, a hunger for something beyond the constraints of imperial protocol. Perhaps she had always felt the limitations of their ancient ways, the suffocating weight of tradition that left no room for innovation or growth. If I agree to this marriage, Lyralii said slowly, what would my role be? Would I simply be a political symbol, or would I have genuine influence in the alliance's strategic planning? Richardson leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something that might have been respect. Princess, if you're going to marry my son, you'd better believe you'll have influence. Marcus doesn't partner with anyone who can't challenge his thinking. In fact, I suspect you'll find that human relationships are far more collaborative than what you might be accustomed to. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a charged particle field. Valdris realized that the humans weren't just proposing a marriage alliance. They were suggesting a fundamental transformation of how power and authority functioned within the imperial structure. They were offering his daughter not just a husband, but an entirely new way of thinking about leadership itself. I need to consider this proposal, Valdris said finally. Such a decision cannot be made hastily. Of course, Richardson replied, rising from his chair. Though I should mention that our intelligence suggests the rebel fleet is massing for a major offensive within the next few months. If we're going to intervene effectively, the integration process would need to begin soon. As the human delegation prepared to leave, Lyralii spoke up once more. Ambassador Richardson, may I ask you something personal? Certainly, Princess. Why are you really here? I understand the strategic advantages for humanity, but this feels like more than simple opportunism. Richardson paused at the door, his expression becoming serious. Because, Princess, we've been watching your empire for decades. We've seen how you've maintained stability across dozens of star systems, how you've balanced competing interests without resorting to genocide or wholesale oppression. But we've also seen how that stability has become stagnation. You have the foundation for something truly remarkable, but you need to evolve or you'll be destroyed by those who are willing to adapt. After the humans left, Valdris and Lyralii stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, the Emperor spoke. You want to do this, don't you? Lyralii's scales shifted to the deep blue of determination. Father, I've spent my entire life studying the histories of failed empires. They all have something in common. They became so invested in their own traditions that they forgot how to change. If this marriage can save our people, if it can teach us to think differently, then yes, I want to do this. Valdris looked at his daughter and saw not the child he had raised, but the leader she was becoming. Perhaps that was the real genius of the human proposal. They hadn't just offered military assistance. They'd offered transformation. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what the Zephyrian Empire needed. The decision that would reshape the galaxy had been made in a small chamber by a desperate father and a daughter brave enough to embrace the unknown. Neither of them could have imagined the consequences that would follow, or the way that one marriage would ultimately redefine what it meant to hold power in a universe where adaptation had become the ultimate survival skill. The wedding ceremony was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. In the grand cathedral of Zephyria Prime, 10,000 years of tradition collided with human pragmatism in a spectacle that left guests from dozens of species uncertain whether they were witnessing a celebration or a revolution. Princess Lyralii stood at the altar wearing ceremonial robes that represented a compromise between cultures. Zephyrian silk embedded with human technological elements that made the fabric shimmer with embedded circuitry. The effect was stunning and unsettling in equal measure, much like the alliance itself. Her scales had settled into the traditional wedding pattern of silver and gold, but there was something different about her posture, something that suggested she was no longer the sheltered princess who had agreed to this arrangement months earlier. Across from her, Marcus Richardson cut an imposing figure despite being nearly 2 feet shorter than his bride. His formal dress uniform bore decorations from 3 different campaigns, and his eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. When he looked at Lyralii, there was no trace of the awkwardness that might be expected from an arranged marriage. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like partnership. Emperor Valdris observed the proceedings from his throne, noting how the human contingent had seamlessly integrated themselves into the Zephyrian court protocol, while somehow making it clear that they were participating by choice rather than obligation. Ambassador Richardson stood beside him, and Valdris couldn't shake the feeling that the human was evaluating every aspect of the ceremony for strategic value. Nervous, Majesty? Richardson asked quietly during a particularly elaborate musical interlude performed by the Imperial Choir. Should I be? Valdris replied, his scales shifting through subtle patterns of uncertainty. Well, you're about to officially welcome humanity into your bloodline. Some might consider that a rather significant development. Richardson's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. Though I suspect your daughter is more prepared for this than anyone realizes. The observation proved accurate as the ceremony progressed. Lyralii had insisted on modifications to the traditional vows, incorporating elements that emphasized partnership and mutual growth rather than the customary pledges of obedience and submission. When she spoke her vows in both Zephyrian and English, her voice carried an authority that made several imperial advisors shift uncomfortably in their seats. I pledge not just my loyalty, she declared, her gaze fixed on Marcus, but my voice, my thoughts, and my determination to build something new from the best of both our peoples. Together, we will adapt, evolve, and overcome any challenge that faces us. Marcus's response was equally telling. I promise to respect your heritage while challenging your assumptions, to honor your traditions while helping you transcend their limitations. Together, we'll prove that strength comes not from rigid adherence to the past, but from the courage to embrace an uncertain future. The words sent ripples of whispered conversation through the assembled nobility. These weren't the vows of a political marriage designed to seal an alliance. They were the promises of two people who genuinely intended to change the fundamental nature of power itself. As the couple exchanged the traditional Zephyrian bonding crystals, now modified with human nanotechnology that would allow them to share emotional states across vast distances, Valdres noticed something that both impressed and concerned him. His daughter had evolved during the months of preparation, absorbing human perspectives and methodologies with frightening efficiency. She no longer moved with the measured grace of Zephyrian nobility. Her gestures had acquired the sharp decisiveness of human leadership. The real shock came during the reception, when Lyralii stood to address the assembled dignitaries. Custom dictated that the bride should offer formal thanks to the families and express hopes for continued tradition. Instead, she delivered what could only be described as a manifesto. "Honored guests," she began, her voice carrying easily across the vast hall. "Today marks not just the union of two individuals, but the beginning of a new era for the Zephyrian Empire. For too long, we have defined strength as the ability to maintain control, wisdom as adherence to ancient customs, and progress as the careful preservation of what our ancestors built." The hall fell silent, the kind of absolute quiet that preceded either triumph or disaster. "But the galaxy has changed around us," Lyralii continued, her scales now blazing with the confident gold of imperial authority. "Our enemies adapt, evolve, and overcome our defenses precisely because they've abandoned the constraints that we cling to. Today, we begin to learn from them. Today, we begin to think like the humans who will now fight beside us." She gestured to Marcus, who stepped forward to join her. Together, they presented a visual that would be remembered for generations. The princess in her traditional robes standing beside a human warrior, both radiating the kind of confidence that came from shared purpose rather than inherited privilege. "The rebellion in our outer territories has succeeded because they fight with desperation and innovation," Lyralii declared. "They strike where we don't expect, use tactics we don't understand, and adapt faster than our ancient military doctrines can respond. But humans have been fighting such wars for their entire history. They understand that survival requires constant change, that strength comes from flexibility, and that true victory often demands abandoning everything you think you know about warfare." In the audience, several imperial generals looked deeply uncomfortable, while the human military advisors nodded approvingly. Valdres realized that his daughter wasn't just announcing a marriage. She was declaring a revolution in thinking that would reshape the Empire's entire approach to governance and warfare. "Over the coming months," Lyralii continued, "you will see changes that may challenge your comfort with tradition. Our military will adopt new tactics. Our diplomatic corps will embrace new strategies. Our entire governmental structure will evolve to meet threats that require solutions our ancestors never imagined. Some of you will resist these changes, viewing them as abandonment of our heritage. Others will embrace them as necessary evolution. But make no mistake, change is coming whether we guide it or it destroys us." The applause that followed was polite, but uncertain, the kind of response given when the audience wasn't sure whether they had just witnessed a promising transformation or a catastrophic mistake. But among the human delegation, the enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. After the formal ceremony concluded, smaller groups gathered for private conversations that would prove far more significant than the public spectacle. In a secure conference room, the real work began. "All right," Marcus said, spreading tactical displays across a holographic table. "Let's talk about what we're actually dealing with. The rebel forces have captured significant territory, but more importantly, they've demonstrated strategic thinking that your traditional forces aren't equipped to counter." Lyralii studied the displays with an intensity that surprised the military advisors present. During her engagement period, she had spent countless hours studying human military history, learning not just tactics, but the underlying philosophy that made human warfare so effective. "They're using our own infrastructure against us," she observed, highlighting supply lines on the hologram. "Every route we've established for efficient governance becomes a vulnerability when the enemy doesn't respect our assumptions about civilized warfare." Admiral Corvex, who had remained skeptical of human involvement throughout the negotiations, leaned forward with grudging interest. Princess, with respect, these rebel tactics amount to little more than terrorism. They attack civilian targets, disrupt trade, and show no regard for the laws of war. Exactly, Marcus replied before Lyralii could respond. They're not trying to win a conventional war. They're trying to make it too expensive for you to maintain control. Every attack forces you to divert resources to defense. Every disrupted trade route weakens your economic foundation. Every civilian casualty undermines confidence in imperial protection. Lyralii nodded, her scales shifting to the deep blue of concentrated thought. In human terms, they're fighting an asymmetric campaign designed to exploit our commitment to traditional rules of engagement. We respond to each attack according to established protocols, which makes us predictable. Predictability becomes vulnerability. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For the first time, imperial military leadership was being forced to confront the possibility that their 10,000-year tradition of honorable warfare was not just inadequate, but actively counterproductive against enemies who refuse to play by the same rules. "So what do you propose?" Valdris asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't align with imperial military doctrine. "We stop playing their game," Marcus said simply. "Instead of responding to their attacks, we anticipate them. Instead of defending fixed positions, we make them defend territory they can't afford to lose. Instead of respecting the boundaries they ignore, we take the fight to places they think are safe." "You're suggesting we abandon our principles," Chancellor Drex said, his scales darkening with disapproval. "I'm suggesting you expand your definition of principles," Lyralii replied, her voice carrying new authority. "Is it more honorable to lose a war while maintaining perfect adherence to ancient customs, or to adapt our methods to protect the billions of citizens who depend on imperial stability?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront assumptions they had never questioned. Valdris looked at his daughter and saw someone who had fundamentally changed during the months of preparation for this marriage. She wasn't just thinking like a human. She was thinking like a leader who understood that survival sometimes required abandoning comfort zones. "General Thex," Marcus addressed the head of Imperial Ground Forces, "your troops are trained for territorial defense and occupation duty. How quickly could they adapt to rapid deployment operations?" "Rapid deployment." Thex's scales showed confusion. "Our doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force applied to specific objectives. We establish control, then maintain it through superior firepower and logistical support, which works perfectly against enemies who fight conventional wars," Lyralii said. "But what happens when the enemy doesn't try to hold territory? What happens when their entire strategy is based on mobility and unpredictability?" The question revealed the core weakness of imperial military thinking. Zephyrian forces were designed to project power across vast distances and maintain control over rebellious populations. They excelled at siege warfare, at crushing organized resistance, at demonstrating the futility of opposing imperial might. But they had never faced enemies who refused to present traditional targets. "We need to create new units," Marcus suggested, activating another holographic display. "Combined arms teams trained for unconventional warfare. Small groups capable of independent operation, equipped for both intelligence gathering and direct action. Forces that can move as quickly as the rebels and strike targets the rebels consider secure. Special operations teams," Lyralii added, the human terminology feeling natural despite its foreign origin. "Groups that can think and act independently, that can adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from central command." Admiral Corvex's scales shifted through several colors of uncertainty. "Princess, with respect, what you're describing sounds more like mercenary units than imperial forces. Our strength has always come from discipline, from coordinated action, from the certainty that every soldier understands their role in a larger strategy. And that strength becomes weakness when the enemy refuses to engage in the kind of coordinated warfare your forces are designed for," Marcus replied. "Look at your casualty reports from the past year. How many imperial units have been ambushed while following standard patrol routes? How many supply convoys have been destroyed while using established shipping lanes? How many communication centers have been sabotaged by infiltrators who understood your security protocols better than you did?" The silence that followed was telling. Every person in the room knew the answer to those questions, and none of them liked what the statistics revealed. Change is never comfortable, Lyralii said quietly. But the alternative to change is extinction. The rebels aren't going to start fighting fair because we want them to. The correct Confederation isn't going to abandon their alliance with rebel forces because it violates our understanding of proper diplomatic conduct. We can adapt our methods to meet these challenges, or we can maintain our traditions while watching our empire collapse. As the meeting progressed into the early hours of the morning, the scope of necessary changes became clear. Military doctrine, diplomatic protocols, economic policies, even the fundamental structure of imperial administration would need to be reconsidered through the lens of human adaptability. The marriage between Lyralii and Marcus wasn't just a political alliance. It was the beginning of a transformation that would touch every aspect of Zephyrian society. When the session finally ended, Valdris found himself alone with his daughter and her new husband. The Emperor's scales had cycled through numerous colors during the discussions, reflecting his internal struggle between tradition and necessity. "Are you certain about this path?" he asked them both. "Once we begin implementing these changes, there will be no returning to the old ways. We'll be gambling the Empire's future on methods that contradict everything we've believed about proper governance." Lyralii and Marcus exchanged a look that spoke of genuine partnership, of minds that had found common ground despite their different origins. "Father," Lyralii said, "the old ways are already failing. The rebellion grows stronger every month. Our allies question our leadership, and our enemies are learning to exploit our predictability. We can change voluntarily, or change will be imposed upon us by circumstances beyond our control." Marcus nodded in agreement. "The question isn't whether to risk change, Your Majesty. The question is whether to guide that change or become its victim. And, in our experience, those who adapt first have the best chance of survival." Looking at them together, his daughter with her scales blazing confidence, and the human warrior who had somehow become a trusted advisor within hours of the wedding ceremony, Valdris realized that the transformation had already begun. The marriage might have been arranged for political purposes, but it had created something neither species had anticipated. A true partnership between minds that complemented each other's strengths while compensating for each other's limitations. The galaxy would never be the same, and perhaps that was exactly what it needed. 6 months after the wedding that shook the galaxy, Princess Lyralii stood in the strategic command center of the Imperial flagship, watching tactical displays that would have been unrecognizable to traditional Zephyrian military doctrine. The orderly formation charts and territorial control maps had been replaced by fluid tactical overlays that tracked enemy movements in real time, predictive algorithms that anticipated rebel strategies, and communication networks that allowed independent unit commanders to coordinate actions across multiple star systems simultaneously. She wore a modified uniform that blended imperial regalia with human military practicality, the ceremonial elements serving to maintain her authority while the functional additions reflected her new role as strategic coordinator. Her scales had settled into patterns that her father's generation found unsettling. The rapid color shifts of someone whose mind was constantly processing multiple variables and adapting to changing circumstances. Beside her, Marcus operated a tactical interface with the fluid efficiency of someone who had fought in a dozen campaigns. His presence in the command center had initially sparked resistance from Imperial officers, but 6 months of consistently successful operations had silenced most criticism. The results spoke for themselves, even when the methods challenged every assumption about proper military conduct. Contact in Sector 7 reported Lieutenant Commander Zek, a young Zephyrian officer who had adapted to human tactical methods with enthusiasm. Rebel raiders attacking a supply convoy using the new pattern disruption technique. Lyralii studied the incoming data, her mind automatically applying analytical frameworks she had learned from human military education. The rebel attack followed their standard template. Fast strike vessels emerging from hyperspace at unpredictable coordinates, overwhelming local defenses through concentration of force, then disappearing before Imperial reinforcements could arrive. 6 months ago, such raids had been nearly unstoppable. Today, they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. "Deploy response team Theta," she ordered, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had learned to think several moves ahead. Execute pattern Gamma 7, and make sure the pursuing vessels maintain pursuit discipline. We want the rebels to think they're escaping. Marcus smiled as he watched his wife coordinate a complex multi-phase operation with the kind of intuitive understanding that usually took years of combat experience to develop. "You're getting scary good at this," he said quietly. "I had excellent teachers," Lyrelii replied, though her attention remained focused on the tactical display. Plus, it turns out that human strategic thinking and Zephyrian analytical capabilities combine quite well. The operation unfolding across the display demonstrated exactly what she meant. Traditional Imperial doctrine would have responded to the raid with overwhelming force applied directly to the point of attack. Instead, Response Team Theta consisted of just 3 modified frigates equipped with human stealth technology, while the real trap was being set by forces the rebels couldn't detect. "Rebels are breaking off from the convoy," Lieutenant Commander Zek reported. "They're following projected escape vector Delta 9. "Perfect," Lyrelii said, her scales shifting to the gold of satisfaction. "Bring the hunter-killer teams online. Time to show these rebels what happens when they become predictable." The tactical display lit up with new contacts as previously hidden Imperial forces revealed themselves along the rebel escape route. Small, fast ships that bore little resemblance to traditional Zephyrian vessels emerged from concealment in asteroid fields and nebular debris, cutting off retreat paths with coordinated precision. The rebels, who had grown accustomed to Imperial forces being too slow and too obvious, suddenly found themselves facing enemies who fought like they did. "This is Admiral Corvex," came a transmission from the fleet's traditional command vessel, requesting permission to provide heavy fire support to the operation. Lyrelii exchanged a glance with Marcus before responding. Admiral Corvex represented the old guard of Imperial military thinking, officers who had accepted the necessity of change while remaining uncomfortable with its implementation. His offer of support was technically appropriate, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were trying to accomplish. "Negative, Admiral," she replied. "Heavy fire support would compromise the operational objective. We want survivors from this engagement." "Survivors?" Corvex's voice carried confusion that bordered on disapproval. "Princess, Imperial doctrine calls for complete destruction of enemy forces whenever possible." "Imperial doctrine is why we were losing the war," Marcus interjected, his tone respectful but firm. "These rebels aren't just criminals to be punished. They're sources of intelligence, potential assets to be turned, and examples to be made for other rebel units. Destroying them accomplishes only one goal when we could accomplish several." The engagement played out exactly as Lyrelii had planned. The rebel raiders, finding themselves trapped and outmaneuvered, attempted to fight their way clear using tactics that had worked against traditional Imperial forces. But the hunter-killer teams had been trained specifically to counter such methods, using human-developed techniques that turned the rebels' own advantages against them. Within an hour, the operation was complete. 3 rebel vessels had been captured intact, their crews taken prisoner. 2 more had been disabled and boarded, their intelligence databases seized before they could be destroyed. Only 1 vessel had escaped, and its route had been carefully guided to ensure that it would carry specific information back to Rebel Command. "Excellent work, Princess," came a transmission from Emperor Valdris, who had been monitoring the operation from the capital. "Casualties? Minimal on our side," Lyrelii reported. 16 wounded, no fatalities. "We captured 47 rebels alive, seized 3 intact vessels, and recovered intelligence databases that should provide significant insight into rebel network structures." "And the escaped vessel?" Valdris asked. "Carrying deliberately planted disinformation that should cause significant disruption to rebel coordination efforts," Marcus added. "In human terms, we're feeding them false intelligence that will make them doubt their own communication security." The silence that followed suggested the Emperor was still adjusting to the idea that allowing enemies to escape could be a tactical advantage. Such concepts violated every instinct of traditional Zephyrian military thinking, which emphasized decisive victory through overwhelming force. "Father," Lyrelii said gently, "the captured rebels are already providing information about rebel safe houses, supply networks, and planned operations." 3 of them have expressed interest in changing sides once they understood the terms we're offering. This was perhaps the most radical departure from imperial tradition. Standard procedure called for rebels to be tried, convicted, and executed as examples to discourage further resistance. The idea of offering amnesty, of turning enemies into allies, challenged fundamental assumptions about justice and authority. Princess Admiral Corvex's voice carried careful diplomacy. The imperial court may have difficulty accepting such flexible approaches to dealing with traitors. Then, perhaps it's time for the imperial court to expand its understanding of what constitutes effective governance, Lyralii replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. The rebellion began because our traditional methods created more dissatisfaction than they resolved. Continuing to apply the same methods will only strengthen rebel recruitment. Over the following weeks, the results of these new approaches became impossible to ignore. Intelligence gathered from captured rebels led to the disruption of 3 major operations and the identification of previously unknown rebel bases. Former rebels who had been offered amnesty provided insights into rebel psychology and strategy that proved invaluable for planning future operations. Most importantly, rebel recruitment in imperial territories began to decline as word spread that the empire was offering alternatives to violent resistance. But the changes extended far beyond military operations. Lyralii had begun implementing human-inspired reforms throughout the imperial administration, challenging ancient bureaucratic procedures that prioritized tradition over efficiency. Trade regulations that had remained unchanged for centuries were revised to encourage innovation and adaptation. Diplomatic protocols were modified to allow for more flexible responses to changing political situations. The resistance to these changes was intense and well-organized. Traditional nobility viewed Lyralii's reforms as an attack on the cultural foundations that had sustained the empire for 10 millennia. Religious leaders complained that human influences were corrupting Zephyrian spiritual traditions. Military conservatives argued that abandoning proven methods was reckless gambling with imperial security. "You're moving too fast," Chancellor Drex warned during a private meeting in the imperial palace. "The changes you're implementing are creating instability among the noble houses. There's talk of organizing formal opposition to your reforms." Lyralii listened carefully, her scales shifting through thoughtful patterns as she processed the information. Marcus, who had become her constant advisor and strategic partner, remained quiet, allowing her to handle the delicate political dynamics of her own species. "Chancellor," she said finally, "what exactly are the noble houses concerned about? That we're winning the war against the rebellion? That trade revenues are increasing for the first time in decades? That our diplomatic relationships are strengthening as other species recognize our new flexibility? They're concerned that you're abandoning everything that makes us Zephyrian," Drex replied bluntly. "Your marriage to a human was acceptable as a political necessity. Your adoption of human military tactics was understandable given our strategic situation. But now you're questioning fundamental aspects of our culture, our government, our entire way of life." "I'm questioning aspects that no longer serve us," Lyralii corrected. "Culture should evolve to meet changing circumstances, not become a cage that prevents growth." The conversation was interrupted by urgent communication from the frontier territories. General Thex appeared on the holographic display, his scales showing the excited patterns of someone delivering significant news. "Princess, we've just received confirmation of a major rebel defeat in the Chronos system. The operation you planned 3 weeks ago has exceeded all expectations." Lyralii felt a surge of satisfaction, but kept her expression neutral. "Casualties? Minimal on our side, as predicted. But, Princess, the rebels didn't just lose the battle. They lost their main supply depot, their primary communication hub, and their regional command structure. Intelligence estimates suggest we've set their operations back by at least 6 months. More importantly, the victory had been achieved through methods that demonstrated the fundamental advantages of human-inspired thinking. Instead of attempting to capture and hold territory, Imperial forces had identified the infrastructure the rebels couldn't afford to lose, then systematically destroyed it while avoiding prolonged engagement. The rebels, forced to defend fixed positions, had found themselves fighting exactly the kind of battle that Imperial forces were designed to win. The rebel commander in that sector has requested negotiation, General Thex continued. He's indicating willingness to discuss terms for his remaining forces. This was unprecedented. For the first time since the rebellion began, rebel commanders were actively seeking negotiation rather than fighting to the death. The change represented a fundamental shift in rebel psychology, driven by their growing realization that the Empire had evolved beyond their ability to predict or counter. Schedule the negotiations, Lyralii ordered. But make sure the rebel commander understands that we're not interested in temporary truces. We want genuine resolution that addresses the underlying causes of the rebellion. After the communication ended, Chancellor Drex studied Lyralii with obvious concern. Princess, you're not thinking of negotiating a permanent peace with rebels, are you? Such a precedent could encourage future resistance. I'm thinking of ending a war that has cost us thousands of lives and enormous resources, Lyralii replied firmly. If that means acknowledging legitimate grievances and reforming systems that created justifiable dissatisfaction, then that's what we'll do. But, Princess, Drex protested. Offering concessions to rebels suggests weakness. It implies that violent resistance can achieve results that peaceful petition cannot. Marcus spoke for the first time during the conversation, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had seen such situations resolve successfully. Chancellor, with respect, the rebellion succeeded because peaceful petition had already failed. The rebels didn't choose violence because it was easier. They chose it because your traditional systems provided no other avenue for addressing their concerns. Human perspective again, Drex said, his scales darkening with frustration. Effective perspective, Lyralii corrected. The perspective that's winning us a war we were losing 6 months ago. The perspective that's strengthening our economy, improving our diplomatic relationships, and creating stability where there was chaos. The debate that followed captured the fundamental tension that had emerged throughout the Empire. Traditional Zephyrian culture emphasized stability through continuity, wisdom through adherence to proven methods, and strength through unwavering commitment to established principles. Human culture, by contrast, valued adaptability above consistency, innovation above tradition, and pragmatic effectiveness above ideological purity. The marriage between Lyralii and Marcus had introduced these competing value systems into the heart of imperial governance, creating conflicts that had no easy resolution. Every decision now required balancing respect for Zephyrian heritage against the practical necessity of meeting challenges that traditional methods couldn't address. The noble houses are planning to petition the Emperor directly, Drex warned. They want formal limits placed on human influence within the imperial administration. Let them, Lyralii said, her scales blazing with confident authority. But make sure they understand that they're petitioning for the right to lose wars, maintain economic stagnation, and watch the Empire collapse while preserving their comfortable traditions. As Drex left the meeting, clearly troubled by the conversation, Marcus turned to his wife with obvious admiration. You know you're essentially challenging 10,000 years of political structure, right? I know, Lyralii replied, moving to the vast windows that overlooked the imperial capital. The question is whether we can change fast enough to survive the challenges we're facing. Below them, the city sprawled across the horizon in patterns that reflected millennia of careful planning and gradual growth. But even from this height, signs of change were visible. New construction used human architectural principles that emphasized flexibility over permanence. Transportation systems had been modified to accommodate rapid adaptation to changing needs. Communication networks had been redesigned using human information theory to resist interference and infiltration. Do you think they're right? Marcus asked quietly. The traditionalists who say we're destroying something precious? Lyralii considered the question carefully, watching the city lights pulse in rhythms that now incorporated human timing protocols alongside ancient Zephyrian patterns. I think, she said finally, that we're transforming something precious into something better. The empire my ancestors built was remarkable, but it was designed for a galaxy that no longer exists. We can honor their achievements while adapting their legacy to meet challenges they never imagined. The transformation that had begun with a desperate marriage alliance was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. But for the first time since the rebellion began, the Zephyrian Empire was not just surviving its challenges. It was growing stronger by meeting them. And at the center of that transformation stood a princess who had learned to think like a human while never forgetting what it meant to be Zephyrian. 1 year after the marriage that changed everything, Princess Laurelii stood before the Galactic Council for the first time as the official representative of the Zephyrian Empire. The massive chamber contained delegates from over 200 species, each representing civilizations with their own ancient traditions and carefully maintained power structures. What they were seeing today was unprecedented. A Zephyrian royal who spoke with human directness while wielding imperial authority with surgical precision. The council chamber itself reflected thousands of years of diplomatic tradition. Seating arrangements followed protocols established before humanity had even achieved interstellar flight, with positions determined by age of civilization, territorial extent, and historical influence. The Zephyrian throne occupied a position of high honor, befitting an empire that had maintained stability across dozens of systems for 10 millennia. Today, however, that throne sat empty. Laurelii stood at the central podium, having abandoned the traditional passive observation role in favor of active participation. Her presentation materials used holographic displays that incorporated both Zephyrian analytical methods and human information theory, creating data visualizations that revealed patterns invisible to more traditional approaches. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying easily across the vast chamber through translation systems that rendered her words in hundreds of languages. "I come before you today not to request assistance, but to offer it. The Zephyrian Empire has developed solutions to problems that threaten the stability of our entire galactic community." The reaction was immediate and varied. Several delegates showed obvious interest. Others displayed skeptical concern, and a few exhibited the kind of hostile attention that suggested they viewed Laurelii's presence as a direct challenge to established order. Ambassador Vex of the Thorian Syndicate, whose government had been providing covert support to the Zephyrian Rebellion, leaned forward with obvious anticipation. "Princess, perhaps you could elaborate on these solutions. The Syndicate is always interested in innovative approaches to regional stability." Laurelii's scales shifted to patterns that conveyed polite acknowledgement while maintaining underlying steel. She had expected this question and had prepared her response carefully. "Certainly, Ambassador. The primary innovation has been our recognition that effective governance requires adaptation to changing circumstances rather than rigid adherence to historical precedent." The statement sent ripples of conversation through the chamber. For species like the Krex Confederation, who had built their entire civilization around unchanging hierarchical structures, the suggestion that traditional methods might require modification bordered on heretical. "Princess," interjected High Counselor Dresk of the Krex, his mechanical voice carrying disapproval through universal translators. "The Confederation has maintained order across our territories for 15,000 years through unwavering commitment to established protocols. Perhaps the Zephyrian Empire's recent difficulties stem from insufficient devotion to your own traditional methods." "With respect, High Counselor," Laurelii replied, activating her first holographic display, "our recent difficulties stemmed from enemies who refused to be constrained by our traditional expectations. Allow me to demonstrate." The hologram showed tactical analyses of the rebellion's initial successes, broken down using human strategic assessment tools that revealed patterns invisible to conventional military thinking. Rebel victories hadn't been random acts of terrorism. They'd been carefully coordinated campaigns designed to exploit specific weaknesses in imperial doctrine. "Our enemies succeeded because they adapted faster than we did," Laurelii explained, manipulating the display to show the evolution of rebel tactics over time. "They learned from each encounter, modified their approaches based on our responses, and consistently stayed ahead of our strategic planning. Traditional doctrine assumed enemies would follow predictable patterns. When they didn't, our entire military structure became counterproductive." Several delegates leaned forward with obvious interest, particularly those from species that had experienced similar challenges to their own authority. The Altarian Republic had been fighting separatist movements for decades, while the Centauri Alliance was dealing with trade disruptions caused by increasingly sophisticated piracy operations. "You speak of adaptation as though it were simple," observed Chancellor Roth of the Altarian Republic. But rapid change undermines the stability that effective governance requires. How do you maintain public confidence when fundamental policies are subject to constant revision? This question struck at the heart of the philosophical challenge that had dominated Lyraliai's thinking for months. The balance between stability and adaptability was delicate, and getting it wrong could destroy everything she was trying to protect. Chancellor, we maintain confidence by demonstrating results rather than demanding faith, she replied, activating another display that showed economic and security metrics from imperial territories. Our citizens support new methods because those methods work. Trade revenues are up 30%, violent crime has decreased by half, and public satisfaction surveys show improvements across every measure category. The data was undeniable, but its implications were unsettling for many delegates. If the Zephyrian Empire could achieve such dramatic improvements by abandoning traditional methods, what did that suggest about the effectiveness of their own ancient systems? These results are certainly impressive, admitted Ambassador Kellogg's of the Vegan Trade Union, but they raise questions about the permanence of such changes. Can methods borrowed from humanity be sustained across species with fundamentally different psychological and cultural foundations? Lyraliai had been anticipating this objection as well. The assumption that human methods could only work for humans revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what made those methods effective. Ambassador, we haven't borrowed human methods. We've learned human principles and applied them through Zephyrian capabilities, she clarified. The key insight isn't that humans have better solutions, but that they have better approaches to finding solutions. They test, adapt, and optimize continuously rather than accepting initial frameworks as permanent. To demonstrate her point, she activated a complex holographic simulation showing how imperial administrators had redesigned trade policies using iterative testing methods borrowed from human scientific methodology. Instead of implementing massive changes based on theoretical models, they had run small-scale experiments, measured results, refined approaches, and gradually scaled successful innovations. This is what we mean by adaptation, Lyraliai explained. Not abandoning our culture, but applying our cultural strengths more effectively. Zephyrian analytical capabilities, combined with human experimental methodology, produce results that neither species could achieve alone. The presentation continued for another hour, covering military innovations, diplomatic breakthroughs, and economic reforms that had transformed imperial governance. But beneath the technical details lay a more profound message that many delegates were beginning to understand. The Zephyrian Empire hadn't just solved its immediate problems. It had discovered methods for continuously solving problems as they emerged. During the break period, informal conversations revealed the true impact of Lyraliai's presentation. Delegates clustered in small groups, discussing not just the specific reform she had described, but the broader implications of her approach to governance. She's essentially arguing that traditional civilization is obsolete, Ambassador Vex remarked to a group of syndicate allies. That any species committed to maintaining ancient methods will inevitably be surpassed by those willing to embrace constant change. Dangerous thinking, responded High Counselor Dresk of the Krex. Such attitudes could destabilize the entire galactic order. If every species decide to abandon their foundational principles in pursuit of temporary advantages, we'll have chaos rather than civilization. But what if she's right? Asked Chancellor Roth of the Altarians. What if our foundational principles are becoming liabilities rather than assets? The separatist movements were fighting use exactly the kind of adaptive tactics she described. Our traditional responses aren't working. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent priority transmission. Ambassador Richardson materialized on the communication platform, his expression carrying the kind of gravity reserved for genuinely significant developments. Princess, he said without preamble, we've just received intelligence indicating that the Thorian Syndicate and Krex Confederation are planning a joint military operation against Terran Alliance territories. The operation is scheduled to begin within 72 hours. The timing was not coincidental. While Lyraliai had been presenting her reforms to the Galactic Council, the traditionalist powers had been coordinating a response designed to demonstrate that human influences could be contained through conventional military action. What's the operational scope? Marcus asked, having joined the communication link from the Strategic Command Center. 57 Syndicate vessels and 43 Krex dreadnoughts targeting our outer colonies and trade routes. Intelligence suggests they believe our alliance with the Zephyrian Empire has made us overconfident about our defensive capabilities. Ambassador Vex had been listening to the transmission with obvious satisfaction, his expression conveying the kind of anticipation that preceded a long-awaited settling of accounts. "Princess," he said with barely concealed smugness, "it appears your human allies are about to face a traditional demonstration of overwhelming force. Perhaps this will provide useful data for your experimental methodologies." Lyraliai's scales shifted through several colors before settling into patterns that her father would have recognized as dangerous. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to think several moves ahead in a game where the stakes were measured in star systems. "Ambassador Vex, I'm curious about your confidence in this operation. Have a Syndicate and Confederation leadership considered how their alliance will respond when they discover that their surprise attack was anticipated, their operational plans have been compromised, and their fleets are flying into prepared defensive positions?" The satisfaction on Vex's face flickered as he processed the implications of her statement. "Princess, even if the humans were somehow forewarned, they lack the fleet strength to resist such a coordinated assault. You're assuming the humans would try to resist using conventional fleet tactics," Lyraliai replied, activating new tactical displays that showed Terran Alliance force dispositions. "That assumption reveals exactly the kind of traditional thinking that makes such operations predictable. The displays showed something that violated every assumption about proper military deployment. Instead of concentrating forces for defensive battles, human fleets were dispersed across seemingly random coordinates. Supply bases appeared to be abandoned, communication networks showed no signs of preparation for coordinated defense, and major population centers had reduced their defensive postures. They're not preparing to defend," Lyraliai explained with obvious satisfaction. "They're preparing to counterattack. While Syndicate and Confederation fleets commit to attacking fixed targets, human forces will be striking at infrastructure those fleets can't defend because they assume it's safely behind their own lines." The genius of the strategy became clear as she outlined the operational timeline. The Joint Syndicate Confederation attack would succeed initially, overwhelming human defensive positions and capturing several colonies. But those victories would be Pyrrhic, achieved by fleets that had exhausted their supplies and extended themselves far from their support bases. 72 hours after your fleets achieve their tactical objectives, Lyraliai continued, they'll discover that their supply lines have been severed, their communication networks have been compromised, and their home territories are under attack by forces that were never where your intelligence indicated they should be. Ambassador Vex's expression had shifted from satisfaction to concern as he realized that the princess wasn't just describing a hypothetical scenario. She was outlining operations that were already in motion. "Princess," he said carefully, "are you suggesting that the Zephyrian Empire intends to provide direct military support to human forces?" "I'm stating that the Zephyrian Empire will honor its alliance commitments," Lyraliai replied firmly. "More than that, I'm demonstrating why traditional military thinking produces predictable results. Your operation was planned using methods that assume enemies will respond according to established doctrine. When they don't, your entire strategic framework becomes a liability." High Counselor Dresk's mechanical voice carried new tension as he spoke. "Princess, you appear to be threatening two of the galaxy's most established powers based on theoretical tactical innovations. The Confederation and Syndicate have fought successful campaigns for millennia using proven methods." "High Counselor," Lyraliai said, her scales now blazing with confident authority, "you fought successful campaigns against enemies who use the same proven methods. You've never faced enemies who deliberately violate your strategic assumptions. Today you'll learn the difference." The next 72 hours would determine whether the transformation of the Zephyrian Empire represented genuine evolution or dangerous overconfidence. But as Lyraliai watched the reactions of delegates around the chamber, she felt the calm certainty of someone who had learned to see patterns that others missed. The galaxy was about to witness a demonstration of what happened when ancient powers met adaptive thinking. And regardless of the immediate results, The very fact that such a demonstration was possible meant that the old order was already changing in ways that couldn't be reversed. Marcus appeared on the communication link one final time before operations began. Lyralii, you know this gamble could backfire spectacularly, right? If our predictions are wrong, if traditional methods prove more effective than we anticipate, the consequences will be severe. Marcus, she replied with the kind of confidence that came from months of successful adaptation. The biggest gamble would be assuming that methods which failed us before will somehow succeed when the stakes are higher. We've learned to think differently. Today we find out whether that's enough. The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed the implications of what they were witnessing. The princess who had stood before them as a diplomatic curiosity was revealing herself as something far more significant. A leader who had successfully transformed not just her own thinking, but the strategic capabilities of one of the galaxy's most ancient empires. Win or lose, the galaxy would never be the same. 2 years after the marriage that reshaped the galaxy, Princess Lyralii stood in the rebuilt command center of what had once been the Zephyrian Imperial flagship. The chamber now served as the nerve center for something unprecedented in galactic history, a truly adaptive alliance that spanned dozens of species and hundreds of star systems. The walls displayed real-time information flows that would have been incomprehensible to traditional military thinking, showing not just territorial positions, but economic flows, cultural exchange patterns, and predictive models that anticipated challenges months before they materialized. The transformation was complete, though the journey had been more turbulent than anyone had anticipated. The joint Thorian-Krex assault on human territories had indeed proceeded exactly as Lyralii had predicted, with traditional fleets achieving initial tactical victories before discovering that their strategic positions had become untenable. The counterattack had been devastating not just militarily, but psychologically. Ancient powers had been outmaneuvered by enemies they had never taken seriously. Status report from the former Syndicate territories reported Commander Zek, who had evolved from a junior officer resistant to change into one of the most effective coordinators in the new alliance structure. His scales showed the steady confidence of someone who had learned to thrive in an environment of constant adaptation. Integration is proceeding ahead of schedule, Zek continued. Former Syndicate military units have been restructured using hybrid command protocols, and economic productivity in those systems has increased by 43% since governance transition began. More importantly, recruitment for the Adaptive Defense Forces is exceeding projections by nearly 200%. Lyralii nodded with satisfaction, but her attention was focused on more complex challenges. Military victory had been the easy part. Reorganizing galactic civilization to prevent future conflicts required solutions that no single species could have developed alone. What about the cultural integration programs? She asked, manipulating holographic displays to show demographic and social data from across their expanding sphere of influence. Marcus, now serving as Chief Strategic Coordinator for the Alliance, stepped forward with reports that reflected the scope of their transformation. We're seeing remarkable success in the education exchanges. Young people from traditional species are adapting to iterative learning methodologies faster than anyone predicted. At the same time, human students are gaining analytical capabilities that exceed anything in our historical databases. The education programs represented perhaps the most ambitious aspect of their social engineering project. Instead of imposing uniform standards across all species, they had developed adaptive frameworks that enhanced each species' natural cognitive strengths while teaching universal principles of flexible thinking. Zephyrian analytical precision, human creative problem-solving, Altarian systematic methodology, and even aspects of former enemy cognitive approaches were being combined into educational systems that produce citizens capable of thriving in rapidly changing environments. Princess came a transmission from Ambassador Richardson, who had become the unofficial coordinator for species seeking alliance membership. We have requests for admission from 17 additional governments, including the Centauri Alliance and 3 previously independent systems that have declared themselves willing to adopt adaptive governance models. This was the development that most clearly demonstrated how completely the galactic balance had shifted. Species that had maintained traditional systems for thousands of years were voluntarily requesting integration into an alliance that demanded fundamental changes to their most basic institutions. The choice was stark: adapt, or become irrelevant in a galaxy where fixed thinking had become a strategic liability. What about resistance movements? Lyralii asked, though she already knew the answer would be encouraging. Minimal and decreasing, Richardson replied. The demonstration effect has been more powerful than we anticipated. When species see their neighbors achieving dramatic improvements in living standards, economic growth, and conflict resolution, traditional resistance arguments lose credibility. Emperor Valdris appeared on the communication link from the capital, his expression showing the pride of a father whose daughter had exceeded his most ambitious expectations. But beneath the satisfaction, Lyralii could see the slight uncertainty of someone still adjusting to changes that had moved far beyond his ability to control or fully understand. Daughter, he said, the noble houses have formally voted to support your candidacy for direct imperial succession. The transition ceremony is being planned for next month. This announcement represented the culmination of a political revolution that had been building throughout the past 2 years. Traditional succession laws require the emperor to formally abdicate in favor of his heir, but those laws have been written for a stable universe where change happened gradually over centuries. The current rate of transformation required leadership that could adapt continuously to circumstances that changed faster than ancient protocols could accommodate. Father, Lyralii replied carefully, are you certain this is the right timing? The alliance integration is still in critical phases, and leadership transition could create uncertainty, which is exactly why it needs to happen now. Valdris said with the wisdom of someone who had learned to recognize when his methods were being superseded by superior alternatives. You've already been making the decisions that determine our future. The formal transition will simply acknowledge what everyone already knows, that the Empire requires leadership that thinks beyond traditional limitations. Marcus stepped closer to his wife, his expression reflecting both pride and concern. Lyralii, you realize what this means, right? You won't just be Empress of the Zephyrian territories. You'll be the de facto leader of an alliance that includes nearly half the galaxy's populated systems. No single individual has ever wielded that kind of influence, which is precisely why it's not going to be wielded by a single individual, Lyralii replied, activating displays that showed the governance structure they had been developing. Power concentrated in any one person or institution becomes rigid, which makes it vulnerable to the kind of adaptive challenges we've learned to recognize. The new governmental framework was perhaps the most radical innovation of their entire transformation project. Instead of traditional hierarchical structures, they had developed distributed decision-making networks that could respond to different types of challenges using whatever combination of species, expertise, and approaches proved most effective. Economic decisions might be coordinated by Centauri systematic analysis. Military challenges could be addressed through human adaptive tactics, enhanced by Zephyrian strategic planning, while cultural conflicts might be resolved through methods that incorporated insights from dozens of different species. The goal isn't to rule in the traditional sense, Lyralii continued, her scales shifting to patterns that reflected both confidence and humility. It's to coordinate, facilitate, and ensure that our alliance continues evolving rather than calcifying into another ancient empire that eventually becomes obsolete. A priority communication interrupted their discussion, bearing the seal of the former Krex Confederation territories. High Counselor Dresk appeared on the display, but his mechanical appearance had been modified with organic elements that reflected the cultural integration programs that had been transforming his people. Princess, he said, his voice carrying none of the hostility that had characterized their previous interactions. The Confederation Council has voted unanimously to request full alliance membership. We are prepared to implement adaptive governance protocols and contribute our technological capabilities to collective defense initiatives. This announcement was stunning in its implications. The Krex Confederation had been the most rigid traditionalist power in the galaxy, a civilization that had maintained unchanging hierarchical structures for 15,000 years. Their voluntary request to join an alliance built on constant adaptation represented a complete transformation of galactic political assumptions. High Counselor, Lyralii replied, we're honored by your request and impressed by the courage your people have shown in embracing such fundamental changes. What convinced the Council to take this step? Dresk's modified features showed something that might have been embarrassment. Princess, our traditional methods were producing increasingly unsatisfactory results. Civil unrest, economic stagnation, diplomatic isolation, all problems that grew worse despite our commitment to proven solutions. Meanwhile, former enemies who adopted your adaptive approaches achieved improvements that our analysis indicated should have been impossible. More than that, Dress continued. Our young people were leaving Confederation territories to join your education programs. We faced the choice of evolving to meet their expectations or watching our most capable citizens emigrate to societies that offered opportunities for growth and advancement. This pattern had been repeated across dozens of species as the Alliance expanded. Traditional governments found themselves competing with adaptive systems that offered their citizens opportunities that rigid structures simply couldn't match. The choice between evolution and irrelevance had become stark enough that even the most conservative societies were choosing change over extinction. The integration process will require significant modifications to Confederation governmental structures, Marcus warned. Are your people prepared for that level of transformation? Our people have already begun implementing preliminary changes, Dresk replied. We've been studying alliance methodologies for months, running small-scale experiments with adaptive decision-making processes, and training our administrators in iterative problem-solving techniques. The formal integration will simply expand successful pilots to system-wide implementation. As the communication ended, Lyralii found herself reflecting on how completely the galaxy had been transformed in just 2 years. What had begun as a desperate marriage alliance had become a revolution in thinking that was reshaping civilization itself. Species that had maintained unchanging traditions for millennia were voluntarily abandoning those traditions in favor of methods that prioritized effectiveness over precedent. Do you ever miss it? Marcus asked quietly. The simpler time when you just had to follow ancient protocols instead of inventing new solutions for every challenge. Lyralii considered the question carefully, watching data streams that showed economic growth, conflict resolution success rates, and innovation indices across their expanding alliance. Every metric indicated that their adaptive approaches were producing results that traditional methods had never achieved. Amidst the certainty, she said finally, there was comfort in believing that our ancestors had already solved all the important problems, that our job was simply to maintain what they had built. But that comfort was an illusion, wasn't it? The galaxy was changing whether we acknowledged it or not. We could either guide that change or become its victims. A new priority transmission arrived, this one bearing the seal of the Galactic Council. The Council President, an elderly representative of one of the oldest civilizations in known space, appeared on the display with obvious reluctance. Princess Lyralii, he began formally. The Council has voted to formally recognize the Adaptive Alliance as the legitimate governmental authority for all member territories. Furthermore, we are requesting that your alliance assume responsibility for galactic peacekeeping and conflict resolution initiatives. The implications were staggering. The Galactic Council, which had coordinated interspecies relations for thousands of years through careful maintenance of traditional balances, was essentially abdicating its authority in favor of an organization that had existed for less than 2 years. Council President, Lyralii replied carefully, we appreciate the confidence you're expressing in our methods. But such a transition would require extensive preparation and coordination. The Alliance governance structure isn't designed to replace the Council. It's designed to complement traditional diplomatic mechanisms. Princess, the Council President said with obvious embarrassment, traditional diplomatic mechanisms are no longer adequate for current challenges. Conflicts emerge faster than our protocols can address them. Economic disruptions spread beyond our ability to contain them. And political changes happen too quickly for our consensus-building processes to manage. We need leadership that can adapt to circumstances we've never encountered before. This conversation crystallized something that Lyralii had been sensing for months, but hadn't fully articulated. The transformation they had initiated wasn't just changing how individual governments operated. It was making traditional approaches to interspecies coordination obsolete. The carefully balanced diplomatic protocols that had maintained galactic stability for millennia were designed for a universe where change happened slowly enough for ancient institutions to process and respond. In a universe where adaptation happened continuously, Those institutions had become bottlenecks rather than solutions. "We'll need time to consider this proposal," Lyralii said diplomatically. The alliance structure would require significant modification to handle council-level responsibilities. As the transmission ended, she found herself facing the ultimate irony of their success. They had set out to save the Zephyrian Empire from a rebellion that threatened its traditional power structure. Instead, they had created methods so effective that the entire galaxy was voluntarily abandoning traditional power structures in favor of approaches that prioritized adaptation over stability. "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward displays that showed dozens of species waiting for alliance membership approval, hundreds of governmental modifications in progress, and thousands of exchange programs that were transforming how young people across the galaxy thought about authority, tradition, and change. Lyralii looked out at the stars visible through the command center's viewing ports, each point of light representing systems where ancient civilizations were choosing evolution over extinction. The galaxy her ancestors had known, predictable, stable, governed by traditions that changed only gradually over centuries, was disappearing. In its place was emerging something unprecedented, a civilization built on the assumption that change was not just inevitable, but desirable. "We continue learning," she said simply. "The moment we start believing that we have all the answers is the moment we become just another ancient empire waiting for someone more adaptive to replace us." 6 months later, Empress Lyralii stood before the largest gathering in galactic history as delegates from over 300 species formally established the Adaptive Confederation, a governmental structure designed to evolve continuously rather than simply maintain existing arrangements. Her coronation speech was broadcast to billions of citizens across dozens of species, but it wasn't a traditional celebration of achieved power. Instead, it was a commitment to temporary authority, to leadership that would deliberately prepare its own replacement by ensuring that the methods they had developed would continue evolving long after their individual contributions were no longer needed. "We are not building an empire that will endure for 10,000 years," she declared to the